When it comes to watercolor painting, I've always struggled with it because I never had the actual chance to take the time and learn it. I didn't know anything about the basic principles and techniques on watercolor painting. When I would paint with watercolor, I would just hope it would look good. So I finally took the time to learn how to paint with watercolor for 5 days. I studied with endless tutorials on YouTube and tried painting what I learned myself to find out the most efficient way to get better at watercolor painting for 5 days. In this video, I'll share with you the 2 fundamental basic techniques of watercolor painting, the painting sequence, and 4 tips for watercolor painting beginners like me. For the supplies, you will need watercolor paint in a palette, watercolor paper, brushes, 2 cups of water, and kitchen towels. For the 2 cups of water, one is for rinsing off your brush and the other is for clean water. The basic techniques of watercolor painting are the wet on wet and wet on dry technique. The wet on wet technique is painting on a wet surface. This creates soft and faded shapes, giving a loose look. This is mostly used when painting distant objects or the background. First, soak your brush with clean water and wet the area you want to paint. Then, overlay the wet surface with paint. Paint gently from left to right, evening out the water, and avoid dabbing or digging on the paper because this could damage the paper. While using wet on wet, if there's too much water on the paper, the water will gather into puddles, creating watermarks on the puddled area after drying. To extract excess water, you can use a dry brush to soak the water out, then wipe it on your kitchen towel. With wet on wet, you can create a gradient while the paint is still wet by gradually adding less paint and more water for a lighter look, or more paint and less water for a darker look, blending the color with your brush. You can also create a cauliflower effect by adding paint and letting the water and paint mix on its own. A unique cauliflower looking texture will appear as the water dries. You can use different colors for these effects too. The wet on wet technique is the most hardest and key skill to practice in watercolor painting. Experiment and get used to the wet on wet technique so you can control the water by keeping the right amount of water on the right spots. The wet on dry technique is painting on a dry surface. This creates hard and detailed shapes, giving a tight and refined look. This technique is mostly used when painting close details. It's basically the wet on wet technique, but you don't wet the paper beforehand. You're applying paint straight away on your dry paper. If you are layering on top of an already painted layer, make sure the painted layer is completely dry. With wet on dry, you can create a relatively soft shape by adding lots of water to the paint you're applying, but it won't be as soft as wet on wet. Now that we know the basic techniques, let's talk about the painting sequence. Start with a rough sketch. I used to skip this part because I didn't want to see any pencil marks when the painting was finished. Due to watercolor being transparent, this is true, but if you sketch with thin pencil marks, you won't have to worry about this. If you skip this part, you wouldn't end up with correct composition and proportion, failing to paint the borderline accurately. I used to try painting from imagination. I just got confused on what I was even doing. What is that? Draw from imagination if you are on a high level, but if you're not, like me, draw a rough sketch before painting. You don't need to sketch everything, just sketch the important borderlines. Next, plan the painting. Once you've drawn a rough sketch, before you start adding paint on paper, have in mind where you are going to use wet on wet and wet on dry techniques, where the lightest areas are, and where you are going to keep the paper white. Having a painting plan in mind will help you paint in the right order. In watercolor painting, you must always paint from light to dark. You have to paint the lightest areas first, then layer the darks on top of them. Because watercolor is transparent, if you overlayer a lighter color on top of a darker wash, the lighter color will look darker. Likewise, if you want a white color on your painting, it's best to leave that spot unpainted. When the values are similar, paint the soft shapes with wet on wet first, then the hard shapes with wet on dry. Wet on wet is mostly the first move you're going to make, which is the background. I used to always paint with wet on dry first, resulting into a hard-edged background. Now knowing the basic techniques and sequence of watercolor painting, I'll share with you 4 watercolor painting tips for beginners like me. Tip number 1. Paint one spot and then paint another spot while letting the paint on the previous spot dry. This can save you lots of waiting time. Being an impatient person, this was very helpful for me. Just make sure you don't paint spots that are connected to spots still drying, or you'll end up mixing paints. Tip number 2. When first starting to practice painting vignettes. A vignette is an image with an ambiguous borderline. Painting on vignettes mean you don't have to fill the whole paper to finish a painting. You can paint on a smaller cutout piece of paper, or you can paint several paintings in one piece of paper. This helped remove pressure on starting and finishing large-scale paintings. Tip number 3. If there's more water in the mixture, you're going to have a lighter color. And if there's more paint in the mixture, you're going to have a darker and stronger color. Get used to mixing the right amount of water when creating the colors. And remember, once applied on paper, as the paint dries, the color of the paint will turn out lighter. Tip number 4. Add layers of paint at the minimum. The paint looks best on the first few layers. If you keep layering paint on top of layers again and again, the paper is gradually going to become weaker, which may lead to paper damage, and the colors won't end up clean. Don't watch my watercolor painting shorts videos. I painted them without knowing the basics of watercolor painting. 5 days ago, I didn't know the basic techniques of wet on wet and wet on dry, or the painting sequence. And most of all, I didn't have much experience on watercolor painting. After painting and learning for 5 days, I still lack experience. But now knowing the basic techniques and sequence, I have so much more fun painting, focusing on the skills and techniques, experimenting and practicing steadily. If you painted without a basic understanding of watercolor painting, like me, I hope you got something out of this video. I plan on continuing my colorful watercolor journey. Best wishes on your watercolor journey too. Let's get better together. Take it easy.